Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Excellent. I'm completely delighted to be here. Thank you very much to the festival. Thank you to Public Books, the hardest working book review in America. If you haven't read it yet, check it out. It's online. That's the only advertising you'll get today. Really excited to be here to talk about media against fascism and about the origins of the world we inhabit today. Let me just go, there we go. Okay, so I actually want to tell a story today, and I want to tell it in about 3 parts. I'll talk for about 40-45 minutes. If you have questions of fact, please jump right in. If you have more conceptual questions, if you could hold those, we should have 15 or 20 minutes for discussion at the end. Also, I'll be signing books, the book that's the basis of this talk, afterwards on the first floor. Very happy to talk with you then, and at any length, and I'm also pretty accessible by email. So, I want to take us back to World War II, but I want to take us back there because of Facebook. I'm going to argue that Facebook poses people like me, cultural historians, with an extraordinary historical problem. Where is it that the mode of self-promotion coupled with monitoring, collaboration coupled with commerce that we see on Facebook comes from? Where did that come from historically? And if you ask the Facebookers, they'll say the lab, but that's not actually accurate. Where it comes from, I want to argue, and do argue at some length in the book, is World War II and the birth of a multimedia mode of making media that was designed explicitly to challenge what people feared at the time were the mass media that made us and made Germany fascist. There was a terrible fear at the time that mass media, in this case meaning film, radio, and the newspaper, literally turned us into fascists. I'm going to tell a story about how a group of anthropologists and artists, mostly associated with the Bauhaus, many of whom worked here in Chicago, actually designed multimedia environments that they believed would be democratic alternatives to the mass media of the time. And then I'm going to argue at the very end that those multimedia environments shaped 2 things: the psychedelia of the 1960s and the multimedia of our own time. So that's where we're going today. All right, let's start with Facebook. So what's Facebook? Well, Facebook is on the one hand a company. It's well, let me just make sure. How many of you are on Facebook? Excellent. You are marvelous citizens of a highly monitored world. I don't know about you. When I use Facebook, I imagine myself as very free and kind of alone. I'm using Facebook to connect with my friends. I tend not to think about the fact that the patterns of connection that Facebook is enabling also connect me through the Facebook interface to a whole series of organizations, companies mostly, that are monitoring my behavior, monitoring my patterns of interaction, and literally reselling those patterns of interaction as data to other firms. We inhabit a world today, ladies and gentlemen, where we have screens around us at all times. I'm carrying a screen in my pocket. You might be carrying one in yours. We have them on the walls. When I flew here on the airplane, there was a screen on the back of every seat. We inhabit a world where we are surrounded by screens. We are offered the illusion of tremendous individual choice, but we're offered that choice within an environment where the range of our choices have been dramatically shaped by large corporations, and in other places, less so the United States, by the state. That combination of incredible openness coupled with incredible corporate control is a combination that ironically has been born from the attempt to resist fascism in World War II. And that's the question that we're going to try to answer here today. How did we get to this Facebook place? A little bit of background about me. So I'm an American cultural historian. I used to be a journalist. I went back to school in my mid-30s. And I've been writing academic books since. For the last 10 years, I've been deeply involved in trying to trace a cultural history of digital media. The world of historians divides into 2 on this point. There are historians of technology who study device development, and there are cultural and intellectual historians who study ideas and symbols. And they don't talk too much to each other. They don't go to the same conferences. I go to conferences in both communities, and it's really funny. They're like, oh, what, huh? They wonder why we think about these other things. So my goal has been to reintegrate the study of media and technology into American cultural history. Now, you would think that a 20th century historian would have to deal with television and radio and cinema. but that doesn't actually happen so much. I'm going to say one snarky thing. I'm going to let myself say one snarky thing. Any American historians here by trade? Excellent. So here's the snarky thing. If you go to a dinner party and you ask an American historian, or you go to a conference and you ask an American historian, a cultural or intellectual historian, what was the great thing that happened in the 20th century? They'll get all misty-eyed. Roosevelt. There's a deep sense in American history that the important stuff that happens in the White House. And I just think that's not the case. I mean, obviously important stuff happens there, but television, radio, cinema, newspapers, mass media, the kind of mass media, the kind of cultural formations that brought us digital media that are transforming the world around us, none of that happened in the White House. And so that's the kind of history I'm trying to tell. I wrote this book, a book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture, tracking the impact of communal ideals from the 1960s on contemporary computing. And I studied a group centered around Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Catalog. Some of you may know the book. Yeah, thank you. I'll slip you that $10 later. Yeah. That group actually, based in California, Northern California, brought us some of the following terms: personal computer, electronic frontier, virtual community. Incredibly active in translating the ideals of the 60s into the 90s. What surprised me when I did that book was the connections between the 60s and the 40s. I had always been told that the 1960s were a period of kind of psychedelic countercultural rebellion against a black and white, locked down, conservative in every kind of way Cold War era. Imagine my surprise then when I was studying Stuart Brand and reading his diaries and talking to his friends and talking to members of the Merry Pranksters, folks like that, to find out what they were reading. They were reading Margaret Mead, Erich Fromm, the psychologist. They were reading Karen Horney, another psychologist. They were reading Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead's teacher, friend, sweetheart at times, and a radical anti-racist campaigner from the early 40s. Now, when I found that radical anti-racist campaigner in the 40s, I didn't even know that existed. Nor did I know that there was a radical campaign in 1950 for gender rights across the United States. These things have just vanished behind the sort of stories of McCarthy that we've told ourselves over and over again, the stories to which the 60s were thought to be an anecdote. So I ended up writing a prequel to that book, and it's what I'll be talking about today, called The Democratic Surround, about multimedia and the dream of a much more democratic society that inhabited the 40s and that I knew nothing about until I dug into the book. So let's go back now, I'm going to put that down, to the late 30s. In the late 1930s, American intellectuals, American journalists have a real problem. The problem is this: Germany has gone fascist. It's a mystery. For many American intellectuals, Germany, even more than France, was the home of high culture. It had brought us Beethoven. It had brought us Heine, the poet. It had brought us philosophy. It seemed to be the home of everything cultural and analytical and rational. How was it, people wondered, that this country of all countries should have fallen in love with a short, mustachioed, wacky former clerk, Adolf Hitler? How did they fall for a dictator? Now, today we might argue that it had something to do with the chaos of the Weimar era, economic chaos, the longing for order in the face of a chaotic situation. At the time, though, one of the most popular explanations was actually that Hitler had mastered mass media ahead of other folks. And there were two kinds of fear here. They're interesting. One kind of fear said that the Germans themselves are insane. Like the leaders of Germany are clinically insane. And they have found a way, through the one-to-many media of mass media, to communicate their madness into the minds of the masses. So that's one theory. The media allow you to communicate craziness. And this is Hermann Goering as he appeared in 1935. From a fascist point of view, he's got quite a styling presentation here. For Americans, he looks bonkers. The second theory was that mass media themselves actually forced their audiences into something like a fascist social relation. Now remember that this is, the mid to late 1930s. Freud has only been known in the United States for about 15 years, and the notion of the unconscious was beginning to circulate through American intellectual circles. The fear here was that the one-to-many nature of mass media caused audiences to turn their attention in a single direction, and as they did that, just mechanically, not through any other force, mechanically, just as you all turn your eyes to the same screen, your unconscious would be awakened by the media, your reason would be bypassed, you would lose the ability to reason analytically, and you would be filled with emotions, filled with feelings, filled with longing for a leader. This is the fear. The fear is that mass media provoke the unconscious as against the reason, make it impossible to be a rational, choosing person, and instead make you a kind of blob of longing, and longing for a leader. And much of the argument here was that, in fact, that's what had happened in Germany. Imagine my surprise when I'm back reading the Saturday Evening Post and other publications in the late 1930s, and I find that they tend to refer to four fascists: Hitler, Tojo, Mussolini, and Roosevelt. I was shocked. They called him the fourth fascist. I was completely shocked. So I started reading and I figured out why. The fear was that Roosevelt had done what the Germans had done, or was doing it. His fireside chats were not just moments to achieve intimacy with the American public. From the point of view of those who were afraid of fascism, American journalists and intellectuals, they were also his ability to reach into the unconscious of the American population and orient their attentions toward the building of a centralized state, which we now call the New Deal. And it was fascinating to me. The point I just want to make is that the fear of media is really pervasive, and its power is really new. So here's just a random poster from the Rural Electrification Administration, and it's just an illustration of what radio can do. And it's meant to illustrate the idea that radio can be beamed from, say, Chicago into the rural wilds of Indiana and Illinois, and it has that kind of power. But I think it suggests something else. These giant arrows beaming toward the house have a kind of destructive feel. They suggest the power of radio waves to penetrate our houses, to penetrate our defenses, to get inside of us. And that's a fear that's very live in this moment. Nor is it an irrational fear. Another thing I didn't know was the absolute presence and visibility of fascism in this period in the United States. So in the late 1930s, we had Nazi summer camps on Long Island. You could send your child. They would learn the special salute. They could wear uniforms. You may have seen recently in the cover of the New York Times, it was just a week ago, Yafang, right? I didn't realize they still had a rule in this town that you had to be of German origin to buy a house in the town. That was still going on this year. Simply astonishing. Okay. You may remember Father Coughlin, the famous bigot, promoted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, had a weekly radio audience of 3.5 million. In 1938, the Gallup organization did a poll. They discovered that 67% of his audience agreed with his views. 1939, Madison Square Garden, 22,000 Americans rally in Jewish New York on behalf of fascism. They hang a banner around the edge that says, "Stop Jewish domination of Christian America." Okay? The things I'm talking about there are pictures of all of this. They're all in the book. They're astonishing, just astonishing. In 1939, after Hitler invades Poland, 1,000 Americans marched down East 86th Street in New York, carrying swastikas and American flags, and they are not booed. They're not cheered, but they're not booed. The crowd's watching. Again, there's a photo in the book. You all probably know Humphrey Bogart, right? Okay, let's just have a brief Humphrey Bogart moment. Name a movie that Humphrey Bogart was in. We can go section by section. Casablanca. To Have and Have Not, great. African Queen, okay, great. How many of you have ever seen a 1937 film called The Black Legion? I hadn't seen it either until I couldn't sleep one night. And there was Humphrey Bogart as a black-shirted American fascist who kills his Polish neighbor. 1937. In the immortal words of Sinclair Lewis, there was a terrible fear at this time that it really could happen here. Okay? So, at the start of World War II, this presents a problem. The problem is this. If we want to go to war, if we want to fight back against fascism, then we're going to have to do some propaganda on our own people to stir them in this direction. But if mass media naturally, by their own nature, transform people into fascists, how are we going to do that without turning our own people into authoritarians? Now, there's a section of Roosevelt's cabinet, and I found some documents on this that really were just astonishingly disturbing. Not his cabinet, one level down, but talking to his cabinet, who said, look, Goebbels is doing an excellent job. We need to imitate his tactics, and we will deprogram the American people when the war is over. He's achieved unity in the American population. We need to do the same thing. And fortunately, Roosevelt sort of pushes that away, but it's a very popular view at the time. Fortunately, there's another view, and it's a view offered by a group of anthropologists, art historians, sociologists, about 60 of America's leading social scientists, who gather in New York, calling themselves the Committee for National Morale. It's the kind of name now, right? If you've lived through the Cold War, it kind of gives you shivers. But at the time, they were actually a very radical group. They were led by an art historian, Arthur Upham Pope. They were very active generating public reports. They reported to the Roosevelt administration. And they operated on two principles. And I want to start with the first one, a bit of a digression, but it's an important one. They believed, thanks to the anthropology of Franz Boas and Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, that every culture, every nation had a modal character type, a modal personality type. So they believed that one of the reasons Germany had gone off the rails was that somewhere in German culture was an authoritarian personality type that had been cultivated by education and then later by mass media. They hoped to produce in the United States a democratic personality type, a democratic character. Democratic character is a fascinating thing. There's actually a huge literature on it in the 40s and early 50s. Democratic character are people who not just tolerate difference, but embrace it. They are people who can make their own choices, be together yet independent. They can be individuals together. They are not a crowd. They are not a mass. They are exactly not that thing in which the unconscious melts you into one. They are individuals together making choices. And so the question that animated the Committee for National Morale was, how can we develop a mode of media making that promotes this kind of character and through it a new mode of American unity? I want to flag two words for you here that are really especially important, and they're going to, I hope, foreshadow a little of the Facebook world as well. This is a quotation from Gordon Allport. Gordon Allport was a leading psychologist in the mid-century, worked with the Boston police to push back on their racism, very much of a liberal, core liberal, taught at Harvard, was in the Harvard Psych department, and was a key member of the Committee for National Morale. You can read the sentence there. Oh, please, Fred, read it. Okay. I love this sentence. It's so beautiful. In a democracy, every personality can be a citadel of resistance to tyranny. In the coordination of the intelligences and wills of 100 million whole men and women lies the formula for an invincible American morale. Two words really matter here. The first is personality. For Allport and members of the committee, the core to national strength was in the individual personality of every member, every citizen. The individual personality was the key to politics. Now, those of you who came of age in the 60s may have been told that the 60s was the era in which politics became personal. I think that's not actually historically true. I think the era in which politics became personal is right here in the 1940s. And the 60s took it up and brought it to life in a new way. The second piece that's important here is they're not going to organize by hierarchy. They're not going to organize top down. It's not going to be a one-to-many system the way that mass media is. What we need to do is coordinate the intelligences and wills of our members. Coordination is the democratic mode of political power, as distinct from hierarchy, bureaucracy, fascism. I hope you're beginning to hear shades of I was going to call it fascism book. Bad, sorry. I don't feel that way about them. But I hope you're hearing shades of Facebook here, which is very much a coordination of individuals in a very powerful way. Now, the members of the Committee for National Morale were great social scientists, but they were not much in the way of media makers. Fortunately for them, they were in New York at a moment when there were about a half a dozen unemployed Bauhaus artists who had just migrated in. The Committee for National Morale designed and expressed the desire for multi-image environments that would let Americans practice making choices, but they had no idea how to build them. And the Bauhaus folks did. Chief among them was Herbert Beier, who went on to have a tremendously important career here in Chicago. He went on to collaborate with the Container Corporation of America. He helped build the first new Bauhaus here in Chicago. And then later he would go on to help found the Aspen Institute and turn Aspen, Colorado into a sort of elite think tank space. But in the mid-1930s, he was a Bauhaus artist who had migrated to the United States with a very highly developed theory of multi-screen exhibition. And this is what it looked like. He called it the diagram of the 360-degree field of vision. In the 1930s, with some exceptions, which I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A, most exhibitions simply had pictures at eye level. So you'd walk up and you'd have, oh, picture, encounter, picture, encounter, picture, encounter. You'd enter a gallery and it would just be a row of pictures at eye level. He offered something very different, as you can see. He was not a Freudian. He was a gestaltist. What he believed was that you formed your personality by making sensual and perceptual choices of experience from your daily life. And you knit those together into what a personality that became whole because you were doing the work of knitting your experience together. In his view, the role of the designer was to provide environments with many things that could be knit together. Images above you, below your feet, in front, behind. You were to be like a human eye moving through these spaces, knitting what you saw into your personality and choosing what mattered most to you. Now, when Beier invented this stuff in the early 30s, he had in mind helping people become more psychologically resistant to industrial culture. He felt the power of factory life, of noisy traffic. He thought, we need to be stronger in the face of that. But when he came to the United States in 1937, he was more than happy to repurpose this design to help produce the new democratic character. Okay, brief water break. Hang on just a second. Thanks. So, the first place Beier's design was actually deployed was here at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1942 in an exhibition called Road to Victory. It was designed with the photographer Edward Steichen, who would go on to develop Family of Man. And it was, in many ways, it's a precursor to Family of Man. And you can see here that it has very large images, very small images. It has things put together in ways designed to produce effects on the viewer. So here's a Farm Security Administration image, farmer, American farmer, war. They asked for it. Now, by God, they're going to get it. Here's Tojo laughing under a picture of Pearl Harbor. Imagine how that might make Americans feel. Now, from our own vantage point, we can see a lot of things to be critical of here. This is a text by Carl Sandburg. It's celebrating the power of red men. We don't talk about red men anymore. We can also see the power of these images to manipulate our emotions. But that's not how the viewers at the time saw it. They saw this as an example of a kind of tremendously freeing environment. I want to read you a couple of quotations. So in the summer of 1942, when it opened, 80,000 people came to see this show in 8 weeks. That's 10,000 a week. What were they there for? Well, the New York Times critic said this. He says, "I think no one can see the exhibition without feeling that he is a part of the power of America. It is this inescapable sense of identity, the individual spectator identifying himself with the whole, that makes the event so moving." This is Beier's theory acted out on museum grounds. Beier's design was to help you literally integrate the experience of the whole into yourself. And here it is again. So another critic writing for a different paper said, "Road to Victory does not mold the visitor's opinions, for that word smacks of the fascist concept of dominating men's minds." For people who went to this show, the chance to wander, to walk down a road was an extraordinary experience. Now, to us, again, this looks very manipulative. Someone also told me it looks a lot like IKEA, which I thought was actually a well-taken point, right? But to viewers at the time, what was so exciting about this show was not just its pro-Americanness, which was relatively common, but the fact that you were free to move at your own pace, that images would be above and below, large and small, and that you would have command of your perceptual faculties. You would be able to choose what mattered most to you. You would literally practice being democratic perceivers together. This is what I'm calling in the book the democratic surround. It is a multimedia, multi-image, or multi-sound space created with the explicit purpose of making viewers more democratic, of influencing their psyches and helping them adopt a more democratic character. And it's an enormously powerful force from about 1945 on to the early aughts, I would argue even to our own time. It migrates through time down two tracks. The first track is propaganda expositions. Starting in the mid-50s, the American United States Information Agency staged multi-image propaganda shows, built propaganda pavilions around the world. And when they did that, they built them along the lines that I've just suggested. They built them explicitly as spaces to produce democratic people. At the very same time that they were doing that work, American artists were taking up a similar task, sometimes working at the propaganda expositions. And these are artists like John Cage, the Black Mountain College School of Artists. They're putting together multimedia spaces that ultimately become happenings and be-ins and take us to the 1960s. So I go to great lengths to work these through in the book, but I'll take you through just a couple of examples of each, and I'll end at the counterculture. So here we are in 1956 in a country that's unfortunately still very familiar to us, Afghanistan. In 1956, China and the Soviet Union were competing with the United States to influence non-aligned peoples, as they were called at the time. And they built big exhibition spaces here at an industrial fair in Afghanistan. We felt like we were being outdone, and so the United States Information Agency rushed to put together a show. And this is what it looked like from the outside. They hired Buckminster Fuller to build a geodesic dome. Some of you who have commune connections may know that he also helped build the commune housing. And inside, they hung it with multiple images, and they actually put a sort of TV camera in the middle of the space. All right, so why'd they do this? One of the most disturbing moments in the archives I've ever had was when I found an explanation for what they were trying to do. I was in the United States Information Agency archives in Maryland, and I found a document, been declassified, that said, we, the USIA, must act like good psychotherapists. We must first identify the psychological condition of our target populations. How democratic are they? How non-democratic are they? Second, we must stage a multimedia therapeutic intervention. Third, we must test to see if, in fact, our intervention has been effective. This is an explicit policy set out in an official document. At Kabul is the first time that process was actually deployed. And this is what the test looked like. I actually got these from the guy who was in charge of the whole program. It's just sort of astonishing, right? So the people who went to the show were men, and it was unknown whether they were literate or illiterate. And so a representative of the USIA met them after they left the building and showed them these pictures and said, was your reaction more like this, or more like this? I don't even know where to go with these. I actually asked the guy who put this all together what the images meant, and he no longer knew either. Okay? But you know, I think that one seems like bafflement. The other two, I don't really know. So this was the state of kind of viewer testing at the moment, at that time, at 56. By 1959, the whole enterprise had become enormously more sophisticated. This is the American National Exhibition in Moscow. You may remember this is where the kitchen debate takes place between Khrushchev and Nixon. It came about because Khrushchev was on American TV, and he just got very upset with an interviewer, and he said, oh, look, if you give me an exhibition in Manhattan, I'll give you an exhibition in Moscow. The Americans were all over it. They did, in fact, have an exhibition in Manhattan. It was pretty well attended. And they had a huge exhibition in Sokolniki Park in Moscow. More than 2 million Soviet citizens came to this show. It was incredible. And we went all out. We sent the USIA. Every major American corporation was represented there. We had cars there. We had sailboats in a pond that was created for the purpose. And at the center of the exhibition, we have what you see here, a geodesic dome designed by Buckminster Fuller, glittering gold on the outside. Yeah, spectacular. It's just unbelievably beautiful. And inside, this 7-screen display by Ray and Charles Eames of the Eames chair fame. I want to give you a sense of the scope, right? So each of these screens is about 35 feet in length. So this altogether, this is close to 200 feet across. And this is an exhibition that they call Glimpses of the USA. What they did, and you can see a picture of it here, is they showed multiple images of the United States. And these are like a slideshow. They're not video, they're slides. So, and each slide is a little bit different. They started with the idea that they simply wanted to convince the Soviets that we had more than one grocery store. Seriously. They thought that the Soviets might think we just had a show trial for them or something, a show grocery. So they brought multiples. But within that, what they were trying to do was what Herbert Beier had set out. They were trying to create a multi-screen, multi-image environment that would influence the Soviets to change their view of America. Okay, second archival moment. This is actually in the Museum of Modern Art. I found 3 different documents explaining the purpose of this show. And they were marked different levels of, one was marked confidential, one was marked secret, one was marked top secret. I love the archives. And there was only one sentence that was different across the documents. The first one said, we hope to stage a multimedia intervention and inspire the Soviets by the range of choices that America offers. The second one said, we hope to stage a multimedia intervention and get the Soviets to begin to question the communist order. Third one, we hope to stage a multimedia intervention, get the Soviets to practice using their perceptual faculties for choice, and so overthrow their government. But what's astonishing to me is that people really believed that media had this kind of power. That if you simply surrounded people with images, they would be forced to choose among them in a way that would turn them democratic. Moscow was also a highly monitored environment. This is what it looked like when you entered the dome, by the way. I wanted to give you a feel of how surrounded with images people actually were in this space. But they weren't just surrounded by images, they were surrounded by monitors. America sent 20 Russian-speaking college students to the event, and they were free to answer any questions that the Soviets posed. And at the end of the day, they were debriefed about the questions that the Soviets posed. We didn't know much about Soviets at this time. My favorite example of monitoring is this. It's the Raymac computer from IBM. It was donated to show ostensibly American technological prowess. It was pre-programmed to answer 4,000 questions about the United States. That's a Russian-speaking translator. The Russians ask the question, he types it in, produces the answer. Miracle, no? Yes, yeah, I know, Siri. But what's really going on here, or at least what's also going on here, is that the computer is, as you might guess, recording the questions. Recording the questions in a database that is then sent to Washington on a daily basis. This is a wonderful thing to study because the USIA kept extraordinary records of the event. Everything connected to it that happened in the Soviet Union was recorded. All the press, all the guest books that people signed when they were there, all responses. There are records of what was stolen from the show. The Russians stole like crazy because they just didn't have these things. They didn't have records. They didn't have books that were on display there. And so they kept records to see what it was that the Russians wanted. Okay, so that's sort of the propaganda expo side. But there's another side, and it's a side that I think is very surprising for those of us who studied the arts. And it's a side that features John Cage. And let me just check so I figure out how deep to go. How many of you have heard of or heard music by John Cage? I love this audience. Thank you. This is great. So I speak, as you might imagine, I speak to college students all the time, and they're like, John Cage, who's that? Because they're 19, right? Thank you. So John Cage. When I learned about John Cage, I learned about him as a hero of the counterculture. He was someone who built environmental music. You may remember that his most famous composition is something called 4:33, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, in which he actually composed no music at all. Rather, he sent a piano player out onto the stage. I'm not going to put all my weight on that. He sat down at the piano, and nothing happened. Eventually, he lifted the lid, sat back down. what Cage was trying to do was to get the audience to hear the sounds that surrounded them. The sounds in the room, the sounds in the air, the sounds of the birds. He wanted the audience to practice knitting together the sounds that surrounded them in order to become more democratic. I was always told that this sort of aesthetic emerged out of Cage's encounter with the Far East in the 1950s. As it turns out, I went back into Cage's early papers, some of which have just been released at Northwestern. Northwestern in the music library has an amazing collection of Cage letters, and I was one of the early folks in there. Not the case. In the early 1940s, the years of World War II, Cage was a conscientious objector living in New York. And he was enthralled with the power of patriotism. And he saw himself as a patriotic actor acting through music. So I'll read you a little piece of his from 1939. He says, in 1939, percussion music is revolution. Sound and rhythm have too long been submissive to the restrictions of 19th century music. Today, we are fighting for their emancipation. Tomorrow, with electronic music in our ears, we will hear freedom. Take that, Jimi Hendrix. But here's the line that kicks me. The conscientious objectors to modern music will, of course, attempt everything in the way of counter-revolution. But never mind, the implicitly American armies will march on. For Cage, modern music was a species of pro-democratic activity. And he actually found his way into the same Bauhaus circles that the Committee for National Morale did. In 1940, he was teaching a summer class at Mills College in San Francisco alongside Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and Herbert Beier and Georgi Kepes. In 1941, Cage actually came to Chicago and taught here for a year in the new Bauhaus. He taught composition. He was very involved with the Bauhaus figures. Then, in 1948, he and his partner, Merce Cunningham, went to Black Mountain College. And they staged some amazing events. A word about Black Mountain College. I was also always taught that Black Mountain College was a center for the arts. And it's been renowned for decades as a center for the avant-garde of the 50s and 60s. What nobody taught me was that it was also a center for avant-garde social science, and that the two were required together. It's really interesting. I had, third amazing archival find. I found a student's schedule for the summer of 1948. Guess what the student was taking? It's just incredible. Music with John Cage, dance with Merce Cunningham, painting with Willem de Kooning. It gets better. Architecture with Buckminster Fuller. Okay, so that's amazing enough. But then the other two classes were equally amazing from my perspective. One was a class in culture and personality anthropology, which you'll remember was the theory of the democratic person. What did it mean to be a democratic person? And the other was a course taught by an official of the United Nations in the history and workings of the UN. Black Mountain College was designed from the get-go as a place for the production of the democratic person. In fact, I want to read you a small passage from John Andrew Rice, who was one of its first presidents, may have been the first, I don't remember. It says in 1942, Black Mountain College was to be education for democracy. Art would provide the heat with which to forge a new kind of citizen. The integrity, we said, of the democratic man was the integrity of the artist. Now that's really interesting. He also went on to say that it was an integrity of relationship. And I think what he meant by that was the same thing that we see in other aspects of the democratic surround. It was an internal integrity, a psychological integrity built from the integration of multiple kinds of experience, a sense that one was oneself in relation to others. So, 1948, absolutely amazing. Went so well that Cage and Cunningham and Fuller were all invited back for 1952. And in the summer of 1952, they staged what art historians are now pretty sure was the very first happening. Now, nobody's really sure what happened there, right? Somebody thinks that David Tudor played some piano. M.C. Richards, a poet, climbed a ladder and read a poem. Somebody danced through the audience. And at the end of the event, teacups were placed on chairs. Now, it sounds kind of random, right? And the question I was curious about was, under what intellectual or social circumstance would it have been so meaningful to people to stage this kind of random action? Like, why does this mean to them? You know, if my daughter did it, I'd just think she was playing and I wouldn't pay any attention at all. I think it was meaningful because it was an enactment of the logic of the democratic surround. It was an enactment of building experiences all around the person that the person could then integrate in their own particular style. They were practicing being democratic people together. And that was enormously meaningful in the Cold War. And they were doing it in a place far from Washington, with an aesthetic that had very little to do by that time with the kind of Cold War politics of that city. In the late 1950s, Cage moved to Manhattan, and in Manhattan, he taught at the New School a series of courses on composition. Those composition courses featured students like Alan Capro, one of the leaders of the happening movement in New York at that time. Cage's class became a center for thinking about the happenings of the late 1950s and early 1960s. And they, in turn, led to this. This is in 1966 at the Riverside Museum in Manhattan, and it's something that a journalist at the time called a be-in. It's designed by the US Company, a psychedelic art troupe that competed with Andy Warhol at the time, and it's called The Shrine, and as you can see, it's electronic. That's a hand painting with a light coming through. This is a giant vibrating eye. It's an environment that you were meant to enter, find yourself surrounded by sensation, make choices about those sensations, and through the making of choices, understand yourself as a citizen of the world. This is the poster for the show, and I thought you might like to see it because you can see this language around the globe. We are all one, we are all one, we are all one. Now, if any of you use Dr. Bronner's soap, you'll know that that's sort of the language of Dr. Bronner's, and this is a sort of hippie mantra. But it's a hippie mantra that actually comes from about 1948. This is also the language of universal humanism. We are all one is the logic of UNESCO. It's the logic of the United Nations. And it's bubbled up through the happenings and the work of John Cage, and also through propaganda expositions, which Cage was also involved with, into the art worlds of the psychedelic 60s. Now, you might think that this is a happy ending to the story. The word be-in blossomed. It was taken up immediately. Just a few months after that 1966 be-in in New York, tens of thousands of people go into Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. You may have heard the song, If You're I won't do that to you. Gratitude on this side, yeah. If you're going to San Francisco, put some flowers in your hair, you know. This is what that was written for. This is January 1967. People went to the park, they danced, they painted themselves in colors. They listened to Timothy Leary say, you know, turn on, tune in, drop out. They listened to music by the Jefferson Airplane, by Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the Holding Company. And it was an incredible day. It was just an incredible day. And within 6 months, the summer of love was in full flower, and the 60s were fully underway. And in many ways, these hyper-individuated yet collective people in the park were the dream of the people that I've been talking about. They were democratic citizens, united in their diversity. But I want to flag a couple of things that have disappeared. And I played it low here, but I play it harder in the book. The first thing that has disappeared here is the anti-racist critique. During World War II, the democratic surround was invented not only to produce democratic people, but as part of a much larger critique of the race politics of fascism and of its American analog. We forget that Ruth Benedict in 1941 wrote a book called Race, Science, and Politics. It was a bestseller that absolutely attacked American racists as the siblings of Nazis. And the Nazi predations triggered an entire anti-racist movement here in the United States, which has been, so far as I can tell, forgotten. We also forget the movements of the late 40s and early 1950s for gender diversity and gender equality. If you ever want to go deeper on this, there's a wonderful book written by a University of Chicago philosophy professor named Charles Morris. It was published in 1950, and it's called The Open Self. And it was also widely read. And in The Open Self, he says, we have, as a country, for too long been wedded to, and he uses a different language, the heteronormative macho styles of the military. We need a world that admits the full diversity of masculine and feminine styles. He uses the words ectomorphs and endomorphs, which were code at the time, but it's a very powerful book, and again, it was very widely read. America had a utopian moment, 48, 49, 50, in which we imagined a world built around many of the principles we celebrate today. As the democratic surround moved through the Cold War, the modes of choice associated with democracy became modes of choice associated with consumption. And the anti-racist critique faded away, the gender critique faded away, and by the time we got to San Francisco in the late 1960s, we were in a world in which people were feeling extraordinarily free, but it was also a world that had started to be resegregated in all the dimensions that I've just outlined. I can go much deeper on that in Q&A. So I guess I've already given away where we're headed here. It wasn't a happy ending. On the one hand, in the 40s and 50s, the democratic surround provides an incredibly powerful alternative to mass media. And I think I'll just show it here. You know, this is an exhibition of The Family of Man in 1955 at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington. And as compared to the passive householders of this poster, the people who are going to this show are extraordinarily free. They can move at will, they can form coalitions, collaborations, any kind of gathering they want to do. They can look up, straight ahead, down. They are free within the space that you see. Trouble is, they're also very carefully managed. On the one hand, the democratic surround is a great alternative to Hermann Göring and his madness through the microphone. But if you look closely at this picture, and this is the reason I love this picture, you'll see that these folks are free, but they're free within an environment that has been very carefully stage managed. Back behind this wall are the people who selected the images they're seeing, who built the walls within which they move. They may feel free, but they are free in terms that have been set by others whom they can't see and with whom they can't interact. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we are now. This is the 2010 Consumer Electronics Show, the most important show in the tech world. And this is a precise copy of a multimedia environment created for the 1970 Osaka World's Fair. It's called the Pepsi Pavilion, and it was created by a group of engineers and artists connected with the movements that I've just shown you. We live in a time, ladies and gentlemen, in which the fascism of the 40s has in many ways been banished, but in which, as part of the process of banishing that mode, we have developed a mode of media making, media distribution, media management that has encircled us and that has given us the feeling of the freedom of choice, even as it constrains our choices, monitors our patterns of interaction, resells those to others, or makes them available to the NSA. And on that rather dark note, thank you very much for being here.